was seen as a bad guy in history but was actually okay. Imhotep, yes, the titular villain from The Mummy was a real guy, but he wasn't the soul-sucking killer who made off with the pharaoh's wife. In reality, he was a skilled architect and physician who designed the famous Saqqara step pyramid, which still stands today. Imhotep is even considered the father of Egyptian medicine, as he oversaw the healthcare of thousands of pyramid builders and wrote a detailed papyrus manuscript that described different illnesses and their treatments. Even though he wasn't a pharaoh, he was given divining status after death due to his contributions. He was only one of 2 non-pharaohs to receive this title. Brutus. He's gone down as committing one of history's greatest betrayals, but what he actually did was choose his republican ideals over a man he personally loved, who had sparked a civil war with an illegal invasion of Italy, and was unquestionably acting like an autocrat. Edit, just to avoid overstating things, republican in the context of ancient Rome basically meant a bunch of wealthy aristocrats ran the show. Still, it had been the lawful governmental structure since Rome kicked out their last king a few centuries earlier. Medusa swore her life and allegiance to a goddess as a temple maiden, told a god no when he wanted her because 1, she had to remain chaste, and 2, maybe she just doesn't want you, babe. Dude? ? Seduce god responds by sexually assaulting her. To punish Medusa for her crimes, her own goddess turned her into a gorgon. Cue my eternal rage fit home. A girl is on an island alone and all these heroes go on quests to slay the monster for glory. She defended herself and is portrayed as a grotesque evil creature. Monica Lewinsky, she was only 22, and he was the president. Why did we vilify her so hard? Edit, sucks to see so many people still see her as the cartoon villain, using her powerful female wiles to take down the unsuspecting head of the free world. It was the 90s, the Anita Hill case just happened. People were still getting fired for not sleeping with their bosses, even if she had a huge crush on him, or enjoyed it or whatever. He held all the power, but we always remember it as her mistake. She's the butt of the joke. It's so sad. Not sure by which standards Napoleon should be deemed okay, but the more I study the time period the more I see most of the forces arrayed against him are much worse and much more focused on repressing social progress. There is also archaeological skeleton evidence that the poor majority of French people started eating a lot better after the French Revolution and through Napoleonic times, but the poor majority doesn't write contemporary history that becomes the standard narrative. So Nero has been vilified as an evil tyrant who burned Rome down while he played the liar, had Christians covered in pitch and set alight to act as torches for his gardens, and overall has been portrayed as an insane lunatic who was deeply depraved. He certainly wasn't the saint, as he did have his own mother murdered, but Nero, like Caligula, were both slandered by the senatorial class, who despised both of them. Nero was actually relatively well liked by Roman commoners, and while he probably wasn't the best ruler, he is not the borderline villainous monster he is portrayed to be in the media, and his fiddling while Rome burned is most definitely made up. It's funny because Constantine the Great, who was venerated by Christendom, actually boiled his wife alive in a bathtub, but you never hear anything about that. Saladin. He is the bad guy in the Crusades who sieged Jerusalem, but he first asked them to peacefully give up the city, knowing the cultural importance. After the siege started and terms were made, only because the Franks inside the city threatened to kill every Muslim and destroy the Dome of the Rock, he allowed the Jewish citizens to resettle, allowed the captured slaves to pay for their freedom, at a relatively low cost, within 40 days. And his love of horse breeding and poetry were extremely influential in Muslim society. By today's standards, was he a saint? Of course not. But by the standards of the time he existed, he was a very compassionate leader who helped stabilize the region. Cleopatra. Now she isn't always portrayed as evil or bad, but she is usually portrayed as a seductress that seduces and controls men to her will. In reality, she was an incredibly smart woman, one of the smartest people on earth at the time, and was a genuinely good ruler even before Caesar showed up. She brought Egypt onto a golden age in every way imaginable, economically, culturally and academically. But she was also a woman who did the sex sometimes so clearly that's what we as a modern audience should focus on, right/s. Not a bad person. But I feel like Ulysses S. Grant is seen as one of America's worst presidents, and I don't know why. He tried his best to oversee Reconstruction and was undermined, hired a lot of black people to his staff, he appointed Sherman General-in-Chief, called for better treatment of the Native Americans, and signed the legislation for Yellowstone Park. I get the feeling his hatred was disseminated from the South, as was love for Robert E. Lee. Also, his whole reputation for being an alcoholic was bullshit too. Most accounts was that he wasn't a drunkard, it's just when he would get drunk, get wasted, because he was a lightweight when it came to drinking. He was kind of anti-Semitic, but he didn't try to kill Jews or deny them rights. He had an admittedly racist notion that Jews were en masse involved in the slave trade. There were some, but actually more Jews fought for the North than the South, but obviously that's excusable. Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavellian is complete nonsense when looking at how this dude lived and the messages he was sending in his writing. He did not respect the Medici family and was critiquing Christianity in a way that went over people's heads. He wasn't writing an instructional manual on how to be a tyrant. He was subtly detailing how tyrannical the whole system was, and how politics and government and wealthy elites and religion stamp out the good. A problem we still face. We describe him as a smart version of Trump when he was actually more of a Bernie. Pontius Pilate occupies a very contentious place in the confluence of history and religion. He's perceived as a subjugator of an oppressed peoples who commits the heinous act of betraying the Son of God, a venal and unscrupulous governor who capitulates to the malignant Pharisees' machinations, or the most charitable modern interpretation as someone attempting to navigate through a politically tumultuous climate in the name of expediency. Jesus and his religious insurgency against the Pharisee had repercussions for Rome. He was morally impelled and professional, obligated to diffuse the tumult. I don't condemn him for his complicity, but I'd like to know what he thinks of his reputation now preserved for posterity as the executioner of a deity people still revere over 2,000 years later. William Bligh, of Mutiny on the Bounty fame. In pretty much every movie adaptation of the story, Bligh is depicted as a cruel slave driver who has men mercilessly whipped for the slightest infraction, and the crew finally had enough of his tyranny and mutinied. Utter and complete bullshit. In reality, Bligh was notably easy on his men for the day, and there is no record he ever ordered a flogging. He was known to allow men on watch in bad weather to come and warm up inside his own cabin. He and Fletcher Christian had been longtime BFFs before the bounty. The mutiny happened because after long, hard months at sea, the bounty had a 5-month layover in the tropical paradise of Tahiti, where many men in the crew began to live ashore with native women, and military discipline started to come unglued. Bligh had to enforce increasingly harsh restrictions, because the natives were eager for any sort of trade, and to get a little native tail, sailors were actually pulling nails out of the ship for trade. He came down hard on Christian because it was his duty to keep the crew in line and he was failing at it. So Christian and about half the crew mutinied, and set Bligh and 18 followers adrift in a small, dangerously overloaded boat. In one of the most mind-boggling feats of survival seamanship in history, Bligh managed to navigate the boat some 3,500 miles to safety. Neville Chamberlain. He gets a lot of crap for appeasing Hitler, but he did it for all the right reasons, not wanting a repeat of the horrors of the First World War, that is a noble goal on its own, and being more concerned with welfare for the millions of unemployed in the UK, rather than massive military spending. In hindsight, it was possibly the wrong choice. A strong policy with Germany from day one might have saved a lot of lives, Who knows, but regardless of the outcome, he was mostly a good man with sensible and laudable priorities. Kind of in between I guess, but Mary aka Bloody Mary, she was the first outright queen by birthright. People rejoiced in the streets when she became queen, but she was largely disliked at the time because she was Catholic and the country had switched to Protestant. She was also disliked because she had married a king of Spain, and could have passed control of England over to Spain, even though she is the one who laid the groundwork for financial reform, naval reform, and exploration. The biographers of the time were largely Protestant, so were obviously not fans of her, and she was dubbed Bloody Mary, thanks to a rhyme, even though Elizabeth I and Henry VIII both executed more people than she did. However, as I said in another comment, a wise history professor once told me, winners get to name things. Nero, the maniacal tyrant he's been portrayed as, is mostly folklore. He was largely free-thinking ruler who wasn't shy about enjoying life's pleasures, and it showed. An unapologetic hedonist who also managed to rule a vast empire when he was just a teenager. He ran a few successful war campaigns, was a first-century populist who was popular with the lower class and taxed the upper class to fund athletic games and contradict amphitheaters. He's the first emperor to kill himself after learning he'd been tried in absentia, and he was the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which started a civil war. He's one interesting cat. J. Bruce Ismay, president of White Star Line and the owner of the Titanic. Ismay often gets the villain treatment because he jumped into a lifeboat when there were still people aboard. He's also been accused of dictating the ship's speed, basically the loud, pompous evil rich guy. But in reality, Ismay was a lot more soft-spoken than people are led to believe. When the Titanic began to sink, he headed straight for the boat deck, ordering crew to get the boats ready. Throughout the sinking, Ismay helped numerous women and children into the lifeboats, only stepping into collapsible sea when he was sure there were no others in the general vicinity. He even refused to look at the ship when she went down. Ismay never forgot the sinking. He lived the rest of his life in seclusion. No one was allowed to mention the sinking in front of him. Most of the hateful things about Ismay were created by the American press, especially Randolph Hearst, who was on bad terms with Ismay at the time. So, basically, Ismay was unfairly judged because he survived a shipwreck. Ismay never forgot the sinking. He lived the rest of his life in seclusion. No one was allowed to mention the sinking in front of him. Most of the hateful things about Ismay were created by the American press, especially Randolph Hearst, who was on bad terms with Ismay at the time. So, basically, Ismay was unfairly judged because he survived a shipwreck. A dingo actually did come and eat Lindy Chamberlain's infant child. Unfortunately, that sort of thing is extremely hard to prove one way or another, and was only resolved fairly recently, 2012. For the last 41 years people made fun of a lady whose child was eaten by a wild animal, akin to a coyote for the non-Aussies. That shit is fucked up. Seinfeld, Simpsons, Rugrats, Modern Family, just to name a couple of mass media productions that have made fun of her in their worldwide reach. Meryl Streep played her in a reenactment of the fucking ordeal. I feel so bad for that poor woman. Her kid's death became a meme for 41 fucking years. Yes, not 32 years. I'm saying 41 years because it still is. Most of all, I blame the Australian police and government for fucking this up and releasing the details. That shit is not right. Edit. I'm glad this got some attention. Hopefully that 16k people who upvoted will go tell more people, and maybe the meme will die out of sheer embarrassment. Thanks for the awards, you beautiful peeps. For the people who still think she did it, get over it. For the coyote comment, it's just how I typed it, and because I live in Canada now they came to mind. I'm going to leave it as is, specifically to annoy the pedantic PPL. My local coyotes are getting fucking crazy in the local park, biting runners and taking pets this past year. Never see such aggressive and habituated coyotes. Alfred Nobel. This is kind of a stretch but funny story. Before his death, a news publication accidentally printed his obituary and they basically blamed him for so much death and destruction, being the inventor of dynamite. So knowing what the world really thought about him and his legacy, he decided to have a new will written up describing the Nobel Prize, and he would give most of his fortune to that foundation to acknowledge and celebrate those who, during the preceding year, have conferred the greatest benefit to humankind. His surviving family only got to share 0.5% of his fortune. At the time of his death, he owned 93 factories and about 30% of all patents in Sweden, so he would have been remembered as a bad guy, but that wake-up call changed him, his legacy, and the world. And Boleyn, when the king sets his eyes on you, you don't really get to say number. He'd already had his way with her sister and discarded her and their bastard son. So instead of being another ruined cast-off, she played her bad hand to the best of her ability and made herself a queen. Eventually Henry got tired of her, which was his mo, after she failed to produce any living sons and he'd already set his sights on gain. He needed a viable reason to get rid of her. And what better way to do it than rumors of infidelity, incest and witchcraft? He probably would have done something similar to Catherine of Aragon if she wasn't from a royal house you did not want to fuck with. Helen of Troy is also similarly maligned. All she did was leave her, probably brutish, husband for another man. Agamemnon didn't give a single fuck about his brother's wife, property, but her abduction did give him a perfect reason to go to war. Even if she tried to hand herself over, to almost certainly be killed by her enraged husband, it wouldn't have ended anything because she was just an excuse. Not really trying to debate whether Helen or the Trojan War were real. That's missing the point. Go jump on all the comments about Hades if you want to be pedantic. Marie Antoinette, she was far from perfect, yes, but she was shipped away from home at 14 years old to a country that hated pretty much everything about her homeland, with an economy that was already starting to fray at the seams. Yes, she lived extravagantly, being literally the queen and having to keep up appearances, but she was often falsely accused of major fuck-ups that she had nothing to do with. She never said let them eat cake. She was impersonated and held responsible for one of the most expensive jewelry pieces in France's history. The people of France were never going to like her, and took every opportunity to hate her more. Some people are interpreting this as me thinking she was a great person. I don't know enough about her to have that kind of opinion. I'm just saying that she likely wasn't the heartless, hedonistic villain she's often made out to be. The Persian Empire gets a bad rap these days. Now make no mistake, the Persians were brutal imperialists and slave traders, but then so was every other empire at the time. The Persian Empire was actually one of the most diverse and culturally accepting empires in human history. Their standard policy of leadership was to allow cultures they took over to retain their own customs, their own laws and even their own leaders, provided they didn't rebel and paid their taxes on time. They more or less left you alone. Plus all subjects got to benefit from the rich trades routes and the security of their armies. On average, Persian citizens, in particular women, enjoyed more rights than nearly any other empire of the time. So whilst I can understand not wanting to be conquered by them, compared to the alternatives, you could have done a lot worse. I always learned that Hannibal, the great general, was a terrifying invading force for the Romans in my history class. The Romans were a terrifying invading force to literally everyone else, and kept slaves. Hannibal is only the bad guy if the Romans are good guys. I like a lot of the debate this has provoked. From my perspective, Rome painting Carthage as the bad guys was always like America saying Vietnamese communists were the bad guys. Maybe they have an agenda that's hostile towards yours, but good lord, it's pianos to peanuts, isn't it? History is written by the victors. If Britain had won, Benedict Arnold would be a hero. So, in 2,000 years, What could we possibly know about these people besides what we Sherlock Holmes out of the ground?